Oh, that's a good idea. Oh, great.
Discussion about Africa often attracts a lot of interest. This room is packed with people all uniquely different. Some are professors, some activists, and some even government employees. The continent often attracts conversations born out of just interest and at times a real desire to inspire change. Inter pares, Carleton University's Institute of African Studies, Octopus Books, and Friends of Pambazuka held such a conversation with Firoze Manji of Pambazuka News. He discussed his book, African Awakening, The Emerging Revolutions. It is an insightful collection of essays offering in-the-moment commentary and analysis on the 2011 African uprisings. Sharing the panel with him was Kane, who is in charge of international outreach at Pambazuka. The following is a part of that discussion, moderated by Jean Symes of Inter pares.
The award-winning Pambazuka News is produced by a Pan-African group of people on the order of 3,000, 3,200 people from across Africa and some people from the rest of the world who contribute to news, articles, analysis. Pambazuka News has a readership of, get this, almost 1 million people, which is quite extraordinary. It's one of the largest and most innovative and influential organizations of its kind in the world. They say in Africa, I actually think in the world. So we're here to talk about one of the newest of the books that Pambazuka has published. It's African Awakening, The Emerging Revolutions. And we have with us to discuss the book and the situation that it reflects in Africa two very distinguished people from Pambazuka. We have Firoze Manji, who is the editor-in-chief of Pambazuka News and the commissioning editor of Pambazuka Press. Firoze, his background is quite impressive. He was the executive director of the African social justice organization FAHAMU. He was the regional director for health sciences at IDRC, worked for Amnesty International, and for the Aga Khan Foundation in the UK. Firoze Manji, thank you very much for coming tonight. Our other guest here tonight is in charge of international outreach at Pambazuka and the coordinator of Friends of Pambazuka that we'll hear a little bit more about tonight. Formerly the deputy director of ETC Group and former executive director and my very esteemed colleague at Inter pares, Kane. When the uprisings in Tunisia and Egypt started happening and got the attention of the media, Pambazuka began to publish a number of articles about Tunisia, Egypt, but also about uprising and protests and demonstrations that were happening in the rest of the world. And then several months ago, I saw Firoze Manji on the indie media television station Real News Network in the US. It was really interesting because Firoze then linked a whole lot of the various uprisings with what was happening in Tunisia, with what was happening in Egypt, and kind of rocked my framework a little bit and how I was reading the news. And I found that really interesting and useful. Then reading the book, you've done that even more, and you've really brought those things together. I wonder whether you could talk a little bit about the process of putting the book together and some of your conclusions after putting the book together, kind of what gave rise to this book, and when you talk about Arab Spring or African Awakening, what are the parallels that you see between what was happening in Egypt and Tunisia and what's happening in the rest of Africa?
Before I answer, I mean, just like to express thanks to Octopus Books, Carleton, and Inter pares for organizing this. Inter pares have been great supporters and close friends of ours, and it's really, really nice to be here and to see so many familiar faces as well. The world's attention was suddenly, I mean, I don't think the Americans even thought it was going to happen. I mean, they were feeding Mubarak and Ben Ali with lots of military weapons and so on. Nobody actually anticipated what was going to happen. I think that if anyone who was in touch with activists in Tunisia and in Egypt would have known that for years, for at least 5 years, trade unionists, students, other activists have been engaged in trying to organize People have lost lives. There have been enormous repression, killings, and so on, and yet nevertheless, people have tried to get things organized. So when it finally broke out, when people hit the streets, this was the culmination of years of organizing, of years of protest that came to be. And the question that it was immediately posed in my mind, and I think amongst many of our comrades, was, why is it happening? In a sense, we were saying, what took so long? And as we started talking to people, as we started commissioning articles for Pambazuka News to find out what perspectives were, I was struck by the fact that the stories we were hearing from Egypt, the stories we were hearing from Tunisia, were telling us our own stories. And that's to say, this uprising in both countries were the result of 30 years of structural adjustment programs, of neoliberal policies, which resulted in massive land loss for the peasantry, massive job losses, declining living standards, the privatization of the commons, the theft of water, the theft of health services, the theft of education services, and so on. I mean, anything that was profitable was privatized, and that which was not was given to the NGOs, the other private sectors, to give as charity things that people who had fought for in their liberation struggles were now being sold to them as either charity or as a commercial good. That was the background, and what we were struck by was what the Egyptians had been facing, what the Tunisians been facing, had been a dispossession of their land, dispossession of all the commons. And worst of all, what they talked about, and which rang a strong bell with all of us, was that they were saying that the worst dispossession has been a political dispossession. That's to say that their governments had become more accountable to the international financial institutions, to the banks, to the corporations, than they were to the citizens who elected them. Does that sound familiar? And that was something that was going on throughout the continent. And we were absolutely amazed at the constant reports that we kept getting. And it wasn't just the uprisings in Egypt and Tunisia which inspired it, because what happened in Western Sahara, for example, was very little known. It preceded what happened in Egypt and Tunisia. And wherever you look, I mean, I can't even remember the countries, but just to give you some sort of idea, Benin, Burkina Faso, Gabon, Senegal, Mauritania, Uganda, Madagascar, Malawi, Mozambique, South Africa, Lesotho, Swaziland, Cameroon, and so on. It's extraordinary. Zambia. It's extraordinary that you find yourself in a particular period in history where suddenly it's happening. And it reminded me of what happened in the 50s. In the post-Second World War period, we were faced with this extraordinary event. Right from Cape to Cairo, Djibouti to Dakar, you had uprisings occurring all kinds of ways. You had both the overt, explicit organizing and of social movements and so on, but you also had the sort of subliminal, informal organizing that happens on the streets, it happens in the ghettos, it happens on the farms and so on. So this was happening in the 50s, and suddenly we are finding ourselves where it is happening again. And I think we're faced with not just an Arab Spring. I mean, we got really fed up with the idea that this was an Arab Spring. The two countries they're referring to happen to be in Africa, and if you look at their history, they have an intimate history throughout the continent. And people talk about Yemen. Well, Yemen is part of the Arab world. It isn't. I mean, even before the imperial colonization of Africa, the Ethiopian empire stretched right across to Yemen.
In there, that's actually one of the things that really fascinates me. We hear so much about sub-Saharan Africa. Is there not a legitimate difference, or how would you talk about that?
Well, I mean, sub-Saharan exists in the minds of Danida, Bernida, Kanida, Fanida, Difid, Bifid, all these. These are European, these are northern constructs, okay? I mean, take Mali, where there's been a coup, where there's been, but also some serious uprisings. amongst the nationalist movement, the Azawad people. The Azawad people these people stretch from the northern parts of Mali all the way to Algeria, even to Tunisia, to Morocco. Now, are they sub-Saharans? You know, is Mali sub-Saharan? You know, there are lies, damn lies, and development statistics. And so, you know, and if you want to construct Africa as poor, you select which ones you leave out. You must, and you talk to the South Africans, they don't like being called sub-Saharan Africans. Nor do the Nigerians, huh? So this is a construct. But all these things are constructs anyway. What has Africa did? Africa was it's only been recently invented. And what is it? It's a history. It's a history of a people. And it means that when we talk about Africa, we're talking about all those people who were either extirpated from the continent or moved out of the continent, and many who moved into the continent. It has been as a historic fact. That's what Africa is about. And historically, Egypt stretched from the western part of Libya to Syria. It wasn't just a little country as it is now on the maps. Africa is a very, very dynamic, living space. And the solidarities that build up arise because people recognize that they have a common history. The common history is forged again around the experience of being colonized, of going before that, of the enslavement, of being colonized, and the struggle for recapturing. I mean, the amount of blood, sweat, and tears that were lost in the independence movement, which established a social contract, that we had health services, we had education, we had access to water, we had telecommunications, we had roads, which were not there under colonialism. And now what? 30 years since the 1980s, all of that has gone. All of that's been sold off. So we have lost what we gained in independence. And so I think there's a move towards, I think there's a real move I sense in the continent. I think probably the simplest way is a reassertion of the right to self-determination. That's to say, people want to determine their own future. And I left out a couple of African countries, didn't I?
I'm sure, there's a lot.
Yeah, there's Greece, there's Portugal, Spain, there's the Occupy Wall Street. It sounds like a joke, but not. What is fueling Occupy? What is fueling the largest Occupy movement, which was 140,000 people taken to the streets in Nigeria? Okay, what was fueling that is the same discontent. Okay, because what we are facing is a massive economic crisis, a massive crisis of capitalism. But we are facing at the same time a growth of discontent. And people no longer have faith in those governments to deliver. They have no longer faith in the ruling class to deliver on those things. If we look at the climate change issue, I mean, you know, if anyone believes the crap that is put out about the green economy, I mean, we know that green economy, its color is green of the dollars. Okay? That's the kind of green economy they want. It's essentially commercializing the air. But there is a massive discontent, and I think that is something that for the first time ever, I think, certainly in my lifetime, there is a potential for us to look across the continents, across the world, whether it's the north or the south, and say, hang on, we're facing the same shit. Should we not be doing something together to overcome that?
In fact, you talk in the book, and various authors talk in the book about dispossession of various kinds, water resources, dispossession of land from land grabbing, monoculture agriculture, mining, oil, etc. And then you talk about political dispossession, which is what the book says is actually happening. And so could you talk a little bit about that, what you mean by that?
As I said, quite simply, it is the fact that our governments are now more accountable to the corporations, the banks, and the international financial institutions. I mean, if you look at the Obama administration, for example, and you list all the people on all the different committees, next to them you can put all the names of different corporations which all of them hold positions in. If we look in Kenya, in my country, you'll see that all policies are determined not by social need, but essentially by what the corporations want. Now they've discovered oil up in the Turkana district of Kenya. It will be disastrous for the people there. Absolutely disastrous. Because they will grab the land, they will destroy that environment. It's a very fragile environment. And it'll turn it into another Niger Delta.
Canada has actually fairly present role in particularly some of the resource issues you were talking about in Africa. And Molly, I want to bring you in here. You have a very long history of thinking and writing and talking about issues of solidarity versus development. I wonder whether you could comment on Canada's role, the role of civil society and of citizens in some of the stuff that Firoze was talking about.
Sure. Well, I think if we share this view, which I do, that this is what's going on, then Canada's role, it's not just Canada's role, it's the nature of the Canadian society and the way in which we're represented internationally. And our government, in the last couple of years, I've been in many arenas where the Canadian government is not only one of the worst actors, if not the worst actor in some, but people are no longer surprised by that. That was kind of the naive discovery when I was working with ETC Group, to go into the CBD or the FAO and say, wow, Canada is just the worst in terms of the role it was playing to undermine any kind of consensus toward bringing together some shared responsibility for managing the future of humanity. And people said, well, you're not surprised, are you? And I think that there is a kind of stunned feeling that, is this who we really are? But I don't know what else we need to know. I mean, if we look at what's happening with the support for Canadian mining companies, with our tax dollars, one of the challenges that we have is to go beyond looking at corporate social responsibility and the impact on local communities. It all gets into a discussion about good companies and bad companies. And I think if we link it back to what Firoze was just saying about countries emerging and self-determination, the place of resource extraction in national development is critical in Africa. If you saw the piece that Jeffrey York had in the Globe and Mail about a week ago, profiling a project that CETA's supporting with IAMGold and a Canadian NGO, and the debate was about whether this was a good thing or a bad thing, but just at the bottom, slipped in, the executive from IAMGold was saying, we're doing this because we want to help. We want young people to get training. And he says, and if these people don't have a window or a door, things could get bad. And he said, well, what would that be? Well, they'd want more royalties and taxes.
Oh, no.
And that's actually the heart of it, I think. It's not whether this company is going to leave a clinic or a school behind. It's who decides how these resources are used, who decides who they benefit. And Africa, as we all know, has a history of having its resources extracted with no benefit to the people who live there, for whom it's home. So as Canadians, I think we have that's one very clear place we can focus, because we're actually big players in mining, and there's lots of people in this room who could say a lot more about that than I can. But it's not the only thing. And I think as long as we're prepared to tell our fellow citizens that the reason there is inequality in the world is that people don't have enough training, or that they don't have access to services that we're going to provide on a piecemeal basis. I mean, would anyone in Ottawa be happy if we decided to shut down all the school boards and let McDonald's run the schools? Because they're here, they're efficient, or a charity. And then we could all go and apply for grants, and so why would that be any more acceptable to people in Tanzania than it is to people in Ottawa? And I think it's on that basis. We just had a great session in Syracuse with some students, and we were talking about the nature of capitalism and the nature of the crisis that we're in. And we talked about the fact that it shapes so much of our understanding, and it has for so long, that it's actually affected our imagination. So when we talk about alternatives, we're very limited in what we can envision. And until a few years ago, I think it was very difficult to get people to acknowledge that change was possible. And I think that the cracks are becoming a little more believable to many people. But someone said, what we really need are liberated zones. And they're not just in the sense of a military liberated zone. It's a zone where people can think differently, can behave differently, can live together differently. And if we look at these uprisings, they actually were doing that. They didn't stay in Tahrir Square and then go home. They lived there. The occupied people lived there. They set up libraries. They fed each other. They took care of babies. And when people got sick, we've been hearing all these stories that are kind of anecdotal, but they build.
Yeah, no, I mean, if one looks at those movements that had protracted guerrilla wars against colonial rule, especially in the Portuguese colonies, for example, what you will see, people like Cabral and others, Samora Machel in Mozambique, they did create liberated zones. They provided their own health services, their own education services. They set an environment which set a shift in the paradigm, the way people thought about who was responsible for providing things. And it's really interesting. When you have 3-4 million people assemble in a tiny square, a tiny place, when you get them all there, there's no health service, there's no food, there's no education, there's no water. They set these things up themselves. And in order to protect citizens, they organize their own security. They've set up protection against these thugs from the police who were coming around terrorizing people. And then when you visit some of the occupied events, you suddenly realize the same thing is happening here. Decision making is no longer by the usual vote or a committee or whatever. Suddenly there are processes going on. There are new ways of discovering things, new ways of arriving at common decisions, new ways of testing out things. If the police say you can't use megaphones, well, they find new ways of propagating their messages. And I think this is the creativity that could potentially be released. But what terrifies me is that, we are living in a period which is, Samir Amin compares the current period with the 1870s, when there was a last major crisis of capitalism. And what that's let forth after 1870 was the colonization of Africa, the colonization of the world. It led to the First World War and the millions killed there. It led to the Second World War and the millions killed there. It led to the rise of fascism in Germany. It led to genocide of untold proportions. So that is the terror that we are facing. But he also points out that there was also a period where the first successful revolution against capitalism happened in some tin-pot little third world country called Russia, which nobody had really heard of. And then we had a revolution led by peasants in China, and then you had the defeat of the Americans in French first, and then the Americans in Vietnam, then you had Cuba. So it's a period of wars and revolutions. And if you don't think that's the case, just pause and think about Iraq, Afghanistan, Libya, Côte d'Ivoire, Somalia. These are acts of terror that have been carried out by the Americans. They are terrified. They have the same analysis. They know that either they intervene or things are going to get out of hand. And so we are living in a period of, certainly in Africa, many protests, many uprisings, which I think will develop in a particular progressive way, as they have in Egypt and Tunisia. But what's happening in Egypt and Tunisia is Act 1, Scene 1. It's got to a point where in Egypt, the military are in command, together with the Muslim Brotherhood. But what have they got to offer? All they have to offer is for the military is repression as well as theft of all, because they own half the economy of Egypt. And for the Muslim Brotherhood, they are quite clear. The solution, they agree with the IMF and World Bank. The solution is more privatization, more opening up of the economy to the multinational corporations, less taxes for corporations, greater exploitation of natural resources. But that's what's caused the current problem. Okay, and so I think we are, in a sense, quite an exciting period as well as terrifying. And exciting because if a ruling class has got itself into a position where it has nothing else to offer but the same medicine that created the problem to start with, Einstein's wonderful saying, you can't solve a problem using the same kind of thinking as that created the problem. If you're in that situation, we're at a huge advantage. We have the ability to create and invent a new world. They can only offer, because for capital to survive, it has to have access to, the nation state should only serve its interest. It has to have access to all these resources. It has to be able to exploit. But it can only do so by opening up the borders, privatizing everything that's available. And I think there is a crisis brewing in the ruling classes that they don't have any alternative to deal with the rising discontent. But that doesn't mean it's going to go one direction or the other. But the key here, it is up to us. We are at a historical moment where I think you can say, actually, we have the capacity to intervene here. We could build networks of solidarity. We can build organizations. We can build interventions. We can help create that new world. And so it's an incredibly exciting time. Yeah, faced with the terrors that could happen. I mean, look what they did to Libya.
One of the things that the book does, I think, very well is there's a lot of analytical pieces, but there's also a number of pieces that actually talk about the real people that you both were referring to and what they were doing for each other and with each other. Two of the chapters that really affected me in the book, it gave me chills, and they were back to back. One was a chapter about testimony from 3 Egyptian women, women of the revolution. And right after that, there's a chapter, the protest diary from Cameroon, which was essentially 24 hours vignettes of what was happening during this massive day of massive protests in Cameroon, with the repression that happened, but also with the solidarity that happened by an amazing woman, Kawala, who was one of the leaders of the protests. And her account of a day in the life of protesting was a very personal account and a very political account, and the personal is political kind of way. I was wondering whether you could, either one of you, could talk about the role of women in these, in the protest movements, the movements to repossess governments and their politics, how women and men are working together around that.
If one looks, I mean, I think it's a qualitatively different time today. I mean, in Egypt, it was young women who were the sort of big organizers of a whole infrastructure as well as the infrastructure of protest. But what they have done is, in a sense, they've created a situation where there's no turning back. The Muslim Brotherhood, whose main agenda is the elimination of any freedoms of women, are simply unable to get that agenda into the public domain at the moment. Because the women's movement has actually become very strong. The protests that have occurred and the acts of the military, for example, the well-known event where they stripped that woman naked in Tahrir Square, has caused such outrage that actually the balance of forces has actually shifted, it's tilted. Women are also a very large part of the workforce, within the trade union movements, within the industrial sector, and especially amongst the peasantry. People don't talk about what has been happening amongst the peasantry, but because there's been extraordinary amount of land grabbing going on in Egypt, right, they are also now a force who are mobilizing around claiming their right to self-determination. I don't know if you want to add to that.
Recently, since the book was written, but also while the book was being put together, there have been some interesting and more complex developments in Africa where we're often, amongst NGO world, we're talking about results. So what are the results of these things? But actually, there are some things happening in various countries in Africa that are really interesting developments, and I wonder if you could comment on a few of them. So it comes to mind ex-President Wade in Senegal decided, before the vote was even finished being counted, actually said, obviously I'm going to lose, phoned the opposition and conceded. This is after some fairly major protests, but actually there was a peaceful transition there. You see a number of African governments who've got together around the Africa Mining Vision, a proclamation about how African countries can use minerals to actually benefit the people whose land is being mined. You see, in fact, Ghana has increased its taxation rate on mines. I believe it's Guinea who's now said that there will be no more secret contracts with mining companies. You're seeing a lot of this stuff. Do you see this as part of the results?
I think these are part of outcomes of social mobilization.
Yeah.
I mean, I think that's what you have to see them as. I mean, the Senegalese case is a classic one. Everyone's sort of applauding, the ballot box. It wasn't through the ballot box. What had happened was that when President Wade decided to introduce, I think, the 16th Amendment of the Constitution, which would allow him on the first round to win on 25% of the vote, young people thought that maybe this wasn't such a good idea. And so they took the streets, and their creativity there was amazing. I mean, dance, music, protest poets, all sorts of, but they really organized. And that led to the crisis in Senegal. And that's what then created the environment where he was unable to either do that or anoint his son Karim to become the successor. And so that set the terrain for elections to take place. But you know, the dilemma the Senegalese face is a dilemma that all of us constantly face when we rely on the ballot box. Because effectively what you have is Macky Sall, Big Mac, is able to do what? He's the guy who held positions in oil corporations, okay? He's the guy who has serious investments and holds portfolios and all sorts of deals with multinationals. He is the person who's introduced many of the structural adjustment programs. Now he's facing a dilemma. How is he going to deliver anything when you have a social movement that is now under protest? And I think the key to this is, you know, whenever I've been speaking in different African countries, is to try to open this debate up, that the issue is no longer about the ballot box. Sure, we need fair elections, but we need to be doing something one step further. We need to be talking about democratization of our societies. It's not just the ballot box. It's saying, well, who decides what is produced? Who decides how it's produced? Who decides for whom it's produced? Who decides what's done with the product? Who decides on who benefits from the production? And I think the same kind of questions can be asked in terms of what kind of health care do we need? Who decides that? How do we organize that? Same with education. Same with every aspect of our lives. And I think the Occupy movement has been beginning, as have the Tahrir Square movements, etc., have been beginning to address precisely those questions, because it is only by answering and resolving those questions about who decides that true democratization takes place, and the ballot box gets reduced to what it should be, a contestation between people who have different programs. The problem is we have parties who all have the same programs with just some smattering of little different color. But I think, to me, that all these elections that have taken place throws up into my mind something I'd really like to open up a discussion about here. Because the ballot box has always been about, bourgeois democracy has been about the election of representatives. They bugger off to Parliament, they pass laws that are in their own interest, and with the rest of us are screwed. Why don't we be talking about the election of delegates? Delegates who, from our communities, we mandate to carry out a particular program. And if they don't carry it out, they're recalled. I mean, that takes democracy to a much deeper level, to say we want a delegate system, not a representative system, because our experience over the last 100 and 150 years is the representational system always ends up with people running away with our toys. I mean, you know, and in the trade union movement, the process of using delegates rather than representatives has been quite well developed. And if anyone who's been in members of trade unions and attended annual congresses, you have people there. And you are mandated by your local branch to stand for and hold and vote in a particular way, because that's what democracy is about. And I think that's the creativity we need to go towards, rather than accept the existing myopic thing which suits a particular class.
As you did the process of putting the book together, putting books together is always a process of conversations and building conversations amongst the authors and ideas. And these authors are a fairly influential, interesting cohort of people. I'm wondering, as you went through that, there must have been a narrative beginning to emerge with these folks. And I'm wondering, sort of in the bigger picture, is there a new narrative emerging around Africa by Africans about what's happening there? And how do you see that? And also, how do you see then Pambazuka's role in nurturing opportunities? And what opportunities are there for Pambazuka to be working on these sorts of things?
You know, I think the bringing together the book concentrated the mind. And it did two things. One, it got a conversation going about where the commonalities are. But it also identified that for us, our weaknesses. places where we knew things were happening, but we had no contact with people to report on and write on. So actually, if you look at the book, there are strong weaknesses. There are some places which are dealt with thoroughly, others we skim. And I think we have to be honest about that. But the Pambazuka project, I mean that was only a sort of part of it. I mean, currently we are publishing, 20, 30 articles a week. I mean, if you think about it, this is the size of it's an 80,000 word, 100,000 word book. Every week we publish 52, 58 books, as it were, a year. What is happening is that in the last 10 years there has been an extraordinary growth of people in Africa, activists, intellectuals, people from social movements, who feel they want to talk about their future. They want to have a say. Well, I don't know. And what Pambazuka has done is purely been a platform which reflects. Sure, we provoke some as well, but it also reflects this growing movement. I often say, I wish I'd invented this because it's such a great invention. But we didn't invent it. It invented itself, and it continues to do so. And so it's a platform where conversations are happening between countries, between sectors. The letters we get when people saying, well, I had no idea this is what people in the health sector were doing. I want to be in touch with them. So there are lots of conversations which go on outside and around Pambazuka. It's a reflection of a movement that is building. And I think we are living in a period where there's a resurgence of the Pan-African agenda. And a Pan-African agenda which is based on understanding our history, because that's what brings us the concept of Pan-Africanism, but also not being imprisoned by that history, to say, what is the Pan-Africanism we want to create? And I think that's the sort of essence of it. And I'm really excited by the kind of conversations that go on in Pambazuka, because they are from lots of different dimensions, reflections of people's aspirations towards self-determination. We have women's organizations who write from their particular historical perspective. We have people from social movements who write in the same issue as somebody like Samir Amin or Mahmoud Mamdani, etc. And not just do that, but at the World Social Forum start having conversations with each other. And so you have these interviews where people, there are real conversations happening. And my frustration is that we started only with Africa, and the pressure on us is to say, how can we not talk about what's happening in Asia? How can we not talk about what's happening in Latin America? How come, should we not be nice to the Canadians and perhaps talk about them sometimes? No, I mean, that there are so many commonalities building up that the parameters are getting quite difficult to manage, because what you're experiencing, what the First Nation people are experiencing with the same mining companies who are screwing us, okay, is an experience we need to know about, and we need to have a conversation about. And so that is really important, and that's where Pambazuka, I hope, will begin to open up and broaden its platform to have commonalities in terms of what our common experiences are.
There's a lot of opportunities for Pambazuka, and opportunities create the challenges of trying to take them. One of the things that you guys are doing that I think is really interesting is this new thing that you've invented, Friends of Pambazuka. And I wondered whether you could take some time to talk a little bit about that.
Sure.
Tell us what it is.
Sure. That's my job.
Yeah.
I'm a friend of Pambazuka. And so is Inter Pares. Yeah, I think the sense that Pambazuka was kind of inventing itself and growing, also it's very striking that it is in many ways a community, or a community of communities, and that it is unique, and that there is this commitment to it. I mean, it's grown, the readership has grown with no money invested in any advertising, no promotion. It's been completely word of mouth, and same with the contributors, and we have volunteers who also do translation. The actual staff that put out Pambazuka News every week are 2.5 people. And that's amazing. And I'm not one of the, I'm not, so I'm gonna, without any reservation say it's amazing. But it's not sustainable. I mean, that's the same number of people who've been doing it for the last 5 years as it's grown. And so in a way, we're kind of caught in our success, that because it's been going on, people just assume it will go on, and then there's even more demands. And when we go around and, launch the book, we meet all these people say, oh, it's so wonderful, and you should be putting more podcasts up and more video casts up, and that's all true. But the human beings who are doing this off a laptop in Cape Town, Dakar, and Firoze is on a plane most of the time. So just the necessity of having an improved website, of having more staff so that we can actually take advantage of what's there and develop it some more, develop the French edition to be as robust as the English edition, the same with the Portuguese edition. We'd also like to have an Arabic edition to link the Arabic-speaking part of the continent. We need to double our staff. Well, from 2.5 to 5, we're not talking about a huge investment. So then you go into thoughts about fundraising and how do you make this more financially viable, and there were initially thoughts about, in some ways, commodifying it to generate more money. But then after some reflection, we were thinking, well, actually, this is a commons in many ways, and that's its richness, and that's what makes it powerful. So we wouldn't want to do something that would break that down. And at the same time, the commons needs to be sustained by the people who value it. And so what we thought we'd do is invite the people who value it, which are the people who write for it, and the people who read it, and who pass it on to their friends, because the surveys we've done show that our readers pass it on to at least 3 people. And that doesn't account, one of our readers is Brian Murphy. So thankfully, it goes to many more than 3 people. And there are other listservs, and then allafrica.com publishes the whole issue every single week. So we're actually reaching a lot of people who keep reading it and probably have no idea where the money's coming to keep it all going. So what we're letting them know, that if this is going to be sustained, it has to be sustained by the people who value it, and that the level of support needs to be accessible to all those people. So this is not an issue of saying we want the people who can afford it to support so the people who don't. It's we want to keep it free and accessible and open to all, which means everybody can give a little bit. And some people can give more, and that's the way it is. And so it's a bit like the public broadcasting model, that if you value this, we're not going to send you a bill, but we're going to ask you to help sustain it with the means that you have and with the level of commitment you can make.
Can you say something about countries which...
Yes. So the most exciting thing, I thought, when we launched this was the first donations came from Africa. So this was not, it really was true, what we thought was true, that actually it does matter to people, that they are using it. And we have now people from, in the last month, 30 countries.
Yeah, 15 from Africa.
And 15 are from Africa. And the others are also from places, we have from Trinidad, from Iceland, from Japan, from India, from Germany, from Belgium, from the UK. Canada, I'll have you know, we're number 1.
Yeah, but it's in Canadian dollars. Canadian pesitos.
No, Canada, we've had some very early responders in Canada. And we intend to grow that membership. But we are, as we're bringing this in, you can imagine, it's a bit complex having so many people from so many different countries with a website that wasn't really set up to do this. And so we're also just about to launch a brand new website that will get all those systems working more efficiently. But that shouldn't prevent you from, pitching in and helping us with working out the kinks. But it's very promising. The staff of Fahamu in Kenya were the first to give. We've had many from Zimbabwe and Mali, Nigeria, Senegal, Madagascar, Botswana, Lesotho. So it's not just one part of Africa either. It's quite dispersed. And we're getting letters from people saying Pambazuka must survive. There's so much more to do. So this is the idea. The idea is that we are consolidating and building this network that could do other things together too. So there is the possibility to do action alerts, to do communication, to have events where people can meet other friends of Pambazuka by relating to people and not just going after their money, although money definitely matters. It's also meant we've been meeting with some foundations in the US, and it becomes a different beast to support if you're going, because we still will need grants. We met with the founder of Mother Jones, Adam Hochschild, and he told us that even Mother Jones, with all the resources that they have and the fact that they're 35 years old, they still need 50% of their budget to come from grants, because publishing in a niche market with a purpose of activism needs subsidy. So that's clarified for us that we actually can't get out of that and still have the mission that we have and still want to be free and accessible to the movements and to people who need to be able to get access to Pambazuka, both in terms of financially but also in terms of the technology, because the bandwidth in Africa is a challenge for many people. It's very expensive. So we want to do more radio. We want to do more podcasts. We want our print publishing to get out to people who are dying to have the books, but our books are too expensive. So we need that to be subsidized as well, so that this information can really flow in ways that are appropriate. And I think that then becomes an expression of this other kind of solidarity that we've been talking about, because the people who are becoming friends of Pambazuka share this affinity, and they are co-users of Pambazuka. So anyone who's been a friend so far is also someone who subscribes, and maybe not every week reads it, but knows what it is. Mm-hmm. So it's not a cause, it's a shared commons and a shared project.
Mm-hmm. And one of the interesting things about this, all the various countries that Molly and Firoze talked about having donations from, this is also without advertising. It's word of mouth, it's on the website, and it's people telling each other this is what's necessary to make sure that we can have this kind of communications link.
For Pambazuka News, I'm Mbonisi Zikhali.